Imagine a world where painters captured misty mountains with delicate brushstrokes, where scholars studied under the soft glow of candlelight, and where inventors tinkered with printing presses and compasses long before Europe dreamed of them. The Song dynasty wasn't loud with conquest. It whispered brilliance through poetry, innovation, and quiet power. So, snuggle into your pillow and let your mind drift back over 1,000 years. Tonight, we're walking through the gardens and libraries of the Song dynasty, from its dazzling heights to its tender fall. Don't forget to hit that bell icon. Let the gentle hum of history lull you to sleep. You begin not with a roaring battlefield, but with the quiet arithmetic of a broken empire. Imagine ledger books in a dusty office in Kaifeng, lines of cramped characters tracking grain and corvée obligations, while outside, a courier ties a receipt to his sash and heads for the river pier. The late 10th century in North China was defined by such small operations, multiplied many times. Before reunification, there were petty kings, Jiedushi warlords, and hastily improvised courts, but beneath the surface of banners and seals was a story of controlled quantities. So many households registered, so many shy of grain owed, so many boats requisitioned, so many crossbow bolts counted out of a chest. A dynasty would rise not merely through ambition, but through the unglamorous discipline of making all those numbers line up. You hear the dull scrape of a clerk's brush across scrap paper, a sound more consequential to the future than any trumpet call. The song rose from the edge of that paperwork. Zhao Kuangyin, later known as Emperor Taizu, did not come from a line of divine kings. He was a soldier's son who climbed through a military hierarchy that had swollen during the late Tang collapse. His early service taught him a deeply practical lesson that armies which owed loyalty primarily to their commanders would always hold the state hostage. When the Chen Qiao mutiny thrust command upon him, it was less a spark of poetic fate than the result of logistics and morale. Soldiers, in winter undersupplied and asked to march farther than their stomachs allowed, chose certainty over principle. What you notice, standing in the cold on the open plain, is how their decision felt physical. The heaviness of quilted armor, the slackness of straps, the soreness in their feet. It was the kind of mutiny driven less by ideology than fatigue, and it produced a ruler who would never again allow the army to become a private estate. In the first years of the Northern Song, the interesting details are bureaucratic, even boring. Taizu's approach was to separate, compartmentalize, and overlap. Generals were honored, placated, and retired with comforts. The tale of inviting commanders to a banquet and persuading them to surrender their posts in exchange for safety reflects the preferred tool of the new state, soft power delivered at short range. Command over troops was separated from command over supplies. Regional commanders could not requisition grain without the agreement of civil officials whose families slept safely in the capital. Every set of hands was checked by another set. In the provinces, the administrative map was redrawn, circuits, prefectures, counties, and the offices that managed them were tidied and standardized. An intendant for transport oversaw the movement of tax grain, and his ledgers were audited by men who had no authority over ships themselves. This was government by friction, where no one could gather momentum long enough to crash through the center. You can follow the policy down to a river landing, where sacks of grain are stacked as high as a man's shoulder, each marked with the seal of a district. Boatmen step carefully over damp planks, counting bales by 3s and 5s, muttering to keep track as sunlight fades. By dark, a clerk reads off a tally in the light of a fish oil lamp, and a guard marks the wax seal to show the cargo hasn't been disturbed. Such scenes played out on the Grand Canal and its feeder rivers because the new dynasty was built on moving rice from where it was grown to where it was needed, and moving it under a system that left no room for improvisation. When you think of state power, think of those seals, cheap, fragile, but meaningful, because everyone knew precisely what broke wax meant. The fiscal order that supported all of this inherited the tang system of the two taxes, but the song adjusted it with a relentless preference for commutation into cash. If a farmer found it easier to pay coin than grain, the treasury preferred coin, and what could not be obtained locally would be purchased on the market and shipped. This required coinage on a scale no earlier state had attempted. Mint officials, worried about copper supplies, about the weight and diameter of coins, about being cheated by shaved edges and counterfeit molds, they made rules about how many strings of cash could be tied together, and built small guardhouses along the canals just so tax cash would not go missing in the fog. It was fussy, unheroic work, the kind of work that makes you want to rub your temples, and it is precisely why the state grew strong enough to knit North and South together. There is also the matter of Kaifeng, then called Bianjing, a city whose life beat to market hours and night watch drums. The song loosened Tang-era restrictions that had confined markets to daytime within designated wards. Lantern light flickered on stalls where cloth sellers rolled out bolts in narrow alleys, and coppersmiths hung ladles from poles that clinked in the wind. You, walking in the evening among these lamps, sensed the logic of a government that realized commerce could be an ally. Control was exerted not only by prohibiting but by registering and taxing. A hawker who knew his stall number and paid his market fee was a subject easier to govern than a smuggler slipping down riverbanks at night. Bureaucrats took notes on the distances between checkpoints and which piers were most prone to theft. They wrote memos about guard rotations and lamp consumption, and in doing so made a capital that was not just a court, but a machine for receiving the empire's wealth. The exam system is where this machine reached into families. It is easy to imagine the more colorful output of the academy, travel essays, poems inscribed on fans, but the real innovation was procedural. Examiners required that candidate names be covered on scripts, wrote guidelines on the weighting of composition versus policy argument, circulated model answers long after the placements had been decided. They posted the pass lists with seals and public oaths to discourage bribery. A bright young man in a small county might now calculate his odds. How many names would the prefectural exam advance? What ratios applied at the metropolitan and palace levels? How many chairs were set in the hall that spring? His mother might ask about the cost of paper and brushes, his father about whether to sell a mule to finance a longer stay in the capital. Through thousands of such conversations, the state embedded its logic into household budgets and family calendars. You watch the state extend itself southward not as a sweeping gesture, but as a series of shipments and notices. Campaigns against later Shu and southern Tang involved fleets as much as armies, and those fleets required accountants. Marines received rations measured to a handful of millet. Siege engineers logged timbers and tar with all the romance of floor plans. When a city surrendered, officials recorded the number of households and examined the granaries, then dispatched clerks to ask about canal depth after spring rains. Men were promoted for writing a good inventory, not just a good dispatch, and this mattered. It meant that the splendors of victory were followed by a tedious but essential sequence of filings, orders to reorganize local offices, instructions about tax commutation for newly annexed counties, proposals for which bridges needed reinforcement before autumn. Meanwhile, Taizu's successors, especially Taizong, continued the work in the north with more mixed results. In pushing toward the old Tang frontier near Yuzhou, the dynasty confronted a different kind of problem, not only the military strength of northern neighbors, but the limits of logistics on those open plains. Grain boated along rivers suddenly needed to be carted. Oxen chewed into the margins of supply budgets. weather-made probabilities that no audit could fully manage. Here, the meticulous procedures that worked so well inside the settled zones revealed their vulnerabilities when lines stretched thin. You stand on a cold morning watching a column assemble, infantry with their round shields, cavalry biting at bits, and think not about loyalty, but about forage. How many days of hay? What happens if a bridge goes out and a wagoner misreads his letter of passage at dusk? Back in the capital, the cabinet, structured with careful redundancies, produced paper. Some papers were truly decisions, the kind that set reforms in motion. Others were simply records, a way to ensure that commands left footprints. The song favored councils where multiple officials had slices of authority. A finance commissioner who could propose a salt tax change could not implement it without two other offices acting in sequence. The stations of the post road carried not only messages but the expectation of response. Every 6 or 8 days a courier should arrive with returns from a circuit. If he did not, someone in the capital would record the lateness and a signal would travel outward. What looks from a distance like an inert network of offices and seals reveals up close as a system of expectations, each modest by itself, but together binding like layers of silk. Ordinary people experienced reunification through calendar notations. In villages near the Yangtze, elders explained to younger men that labor dues were now calculated differently, that a certain portion of the harvest would be weighed against a commutation in coin, that the tally sticks would be cut with notches according to the new guidelines. In towns, merchants were told their scales would be checked by officials using standard weights. Cloth had to be measured by the jang with marks cut in bamboo rulers supplied by the market office. A boat owner learned that he must present registration, papers at each river station, and that each pass cost a small fee, payable in strings of coin tied in lengths of 100. These were not dramatic proclamations. They were, in the lives you imagine, minor adjustments layered slowly until the waterline of routine rose to a new mark. If you listen for the human texture, you will find it in the examination cells at the capital, where candidates spent days scribbling through questions on governance. A boy from a tea-growing hillside might write an essay on the scheduling of corvée labor during flood season, an issue he knew without naming it. Another from a market town might argue for the placement of granaries near navigable river bends, rather than up tributaries that ran shallow in late summer. The exam system didn't merely select for literary grace, it selected for an attentiveness to practical matters wrapped in elegant prose. When those men took office, they brought with them a way of talking about government that made the mundane respectable. When they wrote to superiors asking for more lamp oil for the night guard, they did so with a care for phrases that elevated a minor request into a piece of statecraft. The consolidation of the South through conquest and voluntary submission brought another sort of administrative attention to detail. When Wu Yue offered its lands, the Song state sent not triumphant armies but teams of surveyors and registrars. They drew local maps with charcoal and folded them into packets, annotating river crossings and shrine locations. They counted taxable households and categorized lands by productivity, using terms that had been standardized so that a clerk in the capital could compare two far-off counties as if they were columns in a ledger. You picture them walking along dikes with reed pens tucked behind their ears, measuring field widths by pacing, while a village headman tries to recall how much the old regime had demanded. This was reunification by measurement, its progress, marked by the accumulation of maps and lists rather than trophies. At the same time, the court rewarded poets and painters, patrons of a taste that is sometimes mistaken for softness. The truth is more practical. Cultivating a class of scholar officials tied prestige to service, ensuring that the most ambitious young men would fold their dreams into the apparatus of governance rather than into private militias. The palace exam, presided over by the emperor, ranked men in an order that was both social ladder and payroll. Families recalculated marriage prospects. Bookshops specialized in copies of the classics and commentaries that matched current examiner preferences. In the dormitory lanes of the capital, landladies learned to keep extra lamps and replenish ink cakes because their tenants would cram through the night. You walk past those rooms and smell warm oil and damp paper, evidence that the empire's future was being built in the small economies of rented beds and pawned cloaks. The military, too, was transformed less by drama than by policy. Training manuals standardized drill calls, units were reorganized so that commanders rotated before they could settle into local alliances. Quartermasters were promoted for not losing track of a single tent peg. The army became predictable, which is to say, controlled. Along frontier garrisons, carpenters measured the gaps between palisade posts, and scribes logged forage allowances for horses by season. Soldiers learned to keep diaries because their officers preferred written reports to oral excuses. You can sense how this foreign notion, paper as discipline, seeped into the habits of men who had once trusted only the strength of their arms. It made them part of the same machine as the merchants and clerks in the capital, each man's day subject to a timetable that could be audited. All along there was a constant calculation about risk. The song avoided placing too much weight on any one man, which meant that decisions could be slow, coordination took time. That was a cost the dynasty accepted for the sake of stability, and you can feel that acceptance in the way the court handled setbacks. When plans failed on the northern frontier, the report did not end with blame alone. It ended with proposals for adjusting the number of pack animals per 10 men or for placing a set of granaries 20 ali closer to the line of march. Even in defeat, the bureaucratic mind sought to turn an event into a procedure. This could be maddening, but it had its own kind of courage, the confidence that cumulative improvements might do what single heroes could not. By the close of this first phase of unification, the empire was again more a system than a spectacle. The very dullness of its inner workings was an achievement. There were no war drums announcing market closures. Life spilled into evening, and tax receipts transformed from sacks of grain to strings of cash. A generation grew up knowing the capital as a place where you could approach an office window and learn precisely which stamp you needed to move a boatload of rice. If you wanted to know whether reunification had succeeded, you would not ask only about flags and forts. You would ask about tallies and seals, about whether a clerk could expect his mail to arrive within the week, about whether a candidate could recite the standard formula for memorials in his sleep. Yet if you pause at the edge of this triumph and listen carefully, you may hear a quieter, longer question echoing beneath the shuffle of papers and the scrape of boat poles. In making the empire safe from warlords and binding it with rules and examinations, had the dynasty also chosen a path that valued order above flexibility, negotiation above daring, and the brush above the blade? And if it had, what would happen when the circumstances of power called once again for speed, improvisation, and the acceptance of risk that a ledger cannot measure? You step into the capital on a morning when the air is cool enough to keep ink crisp on the page, and the streets are already a slow river of bodies moving toward work. This is Bianjing as it settles into being the head and lungs of an expanding state, and you can feel how breath becomes order. Halls of audience open and close like valves. Runners pass folded memorials from one office to another. Clerks tilt their heads toward courtyard benches to better catch instructions delivered. In low voices, a dynasty that began with a mutiny now keeps time by the scratch of brushes and the creak of archive doors. When you try to see what centralization looks like, you do not picture a single command. You picture overlapping authorities like silk, layers, each thin but together strong enough to hold the shape of a realm. Inside the cabinet chambers, precedence and procedure matter. Titles like Grand Councillor and Vice Councillor are attached to bodies that are almost always tired, men who rise before dawn because the emperor prefers to read overnight memorials at the first drum. They convene not to shout, but to sift, reports on harvests, petitions to move a magistrate whose health has failed, notes on a leak in the roof of the Southern Records Room, proposals to standardize paper size so that more pages fit into a single case. The architecture of control shows itself in such small proposals. Paper size will determine how quickly a file can be pulled and moved. Seals will determine how quickly a command can be verified. Audit cycles will determine whether an ambitious man tries to cut a corner or waits it out. The reforms of the early Northern Song are not only about who sits where in court, they are about which instructions carry which countersignature and who keeps the second copy of a ledger. Across the city, the Privy Council meets in a separate compound because military and civil channels are meant to be distinct enough that neither can swallow the other whole. The generals who come to the council are dignified and watched, compensated handsomely, and moved regularly. Here, the empire's military communications are recorded with the same care as civilian ones, but their tone is different. Supply tables, in careful columns, winter coat requisitions with dates and locations, repair schedules for riverine boats, postings for border scouts with a note that the scout's cousin is to remain in the interior to prevent divided loyalties. The separation of logistics and command, so that a general cannot feed himself independent of civil approval, is a core principle of this architecture. It is the state's precaution against the very origin of its founder's power. Circle outward on the map, and you find circuits and prefectures that mirror the capital's structure in miniature. The fiscal commissioners in the circuits oversee revenue, the judicial commissioners review cases and correct what the centre would call errors, and the localities would call latitude. The transport intendants manage the flow of tax grain and market goods, timing loads around river depth like a farmer watches weather. Prefectural offices send annotated returns in a set format, even noting the number of blank forms left in supply to ensure they are replaced before a busy season. County magistrates, young men too green to be left without oversight, are expected to meet monthly with assistant clerks to reconcile household registers against market stall lists and monastery rosters, and to send the reconciled list to the circuit, which sends a digest to the centre. A single household might appear on multiple lists if it owns land, sells salt, and houses monks. The point is not to catch anyone out, though that happens, but to ensure that the institutions that organize wealth and belief are visible to the state. The frontier sharpens the logic. North of the capital, the plains open, and the suture lines of the old empire are still tender. Patrols move along the edges where the jurisdiction of one dynasty meets another, and an agreement emerges from years of strain to preserve interior order. Concessions will be made at the perimeter. The treaty that follows formal skirmishes and failures is built out of plain calculations, annual payments expressed in bolts of silk and silver ingots, negotiable enough to keep serviceable, and precise enough to budget. The men who negotiate it are not immortalized in bronze. Their job is to write a number that the treasury can meet without breaking the market, to set in motion a steady outward flow whose predictable rhythm buys a predictable peace. You can hear the criticism as you walk back to the city that this is purchase, not honor. But those who have watched bad harvests pile on top of recruitment shortfalls and splintered chains of command know that what the state buys is time, a commodity it can convert into grain ships and dock repairs and recruitment, bonuses for good carpenters. Inside the city, carpenters are indeed rewarded because centralization makes demands on wood as surely as on men. Archives need shelving, new markets need stalls, the post stations on the great roads need roofs that do not give way in spring rains. The post office, which in other times is a metaphor, here is a machine you can walk through, storerooms with saddle blankets hung to dry, racks with spare stirrup leathers, a cupboard with small bells to fasten to a courier's belt for night riding. A schedule is pinned to the wall where the headman can see it. A strip of bamboo marked with notches serves as a portable calendar. A board on a peg records delays and reasons. Couriers are paid not by distance alone, but by consistency, and slow cycles result in gentle but relentless scrutiny. Every late report triggers an inquiry, usually resolved by noting a washed-out bridge upstream or a mule's colic, but the knowledge that every late report leaves a paper trail discourages laziness in a way scolding cannot. The culture of memorial writing grows as channels proliferate. A medium-rank official writes a clear memorial on the danger posed by unregulated night markets near Buddhist temples, arguing that the noise disturbs meditation and the lamps are a fire hazard. Another writes a counter-memorial pointing out that night markets keep urban food prices stable by smoothing supply, and that lantern regulations can mitigate the fire risk. The emperor reads and sends down a balanced response, an order specifying distance limits around monasteries, a fee schedule for night stalls to fund extra watch patrols, and a directive that temple bell times be posted so that stallkeepers know when to lower their voices. The point is not that the sovereign is busy with trivia. The point is that the trivial is how power lands on the ground. In a city where a night seller hangs a permit from his stall and a monk can point to the posted bell times, the web of order consists of small, almost boring threads. Taxes and monopolies are the quiet baseline under every conversation. The salt administration is a state within a state, complicated by the fact that salt is essential and easily smuggled. Licenses are printed with a pattern difficult to copy, and patrol boats are set to cruise certain inlets in cycles that vary just enough to be unpredictable. When the license printing office proposes to change the ink formula for the red chop, it sends 3 sample sheets to the Fiscal Commission for testing in steam and sunlight. The tea monopoly is similarly technical. Official tea is pressed into standard cakes for transport, stamped and inventoried. Private growers who exceed a certain threshold must sell a portion to the state at a regulated price that tries to balance revenue against the risk of driving growers out of compliance. You watch a tea agent weigh bundles with a scale whose counterweights are stamped with the market office seal, your eye drawn not to the agent's authority but to the humble mechanics of balance. Urban security adapts to growth that centralization encourages. The city expands, wards loosen, night streets grow crowded, and the constabulary develops routines that rely as much on predictability as on force. Patrol routes are mapped and rotated, lamp pillars are numbered so that a report can reference a place without long descriptions. Drums at certain corners beat a code that indicates the hour and the condition of nearby posts. A watchman fills out a damp slip of paper indicating that lamp 47 had to be refueled twice, and that a gutter near the northwest wall is clogged with winter leaves. The slip is folded into a pouch with others and taken to the ward office, where a clerk compiles them into a week's digest. It is monotonous, and it operates by the assumption that a city kept on schedule is a city that requires fewer arrests. This is centralization as a theory of human behavior. Make regularity the default, and bad surprises become rarer. In the countryside, the logic is no less meticulous. Household registration rolls are revised after the harvest, because families often shift in autumn, sons marrying and moving into adjacent courtyards, elderly parents carried to a cousin's place after illness. The scribe in charge of rolls knows the households by sight. He is formally under the magistrate, but informally dependent on village elders who can tell him which new baby lived and which did not. Tax commutation into cash proceeds with a rhythm stabilized by markets, more stalls on every fifth day, predictable buyers for surplus millet and cotton yarn, a predictable exchange of harvest for strings of coins that will be measured by the weight of copper rather than the length of rope. The magistrate's office posts an announcement that for this year's commutation, 10 strings will be counted by weight on the market scale rather than by a fixed number of coins, because too many shaved coins have reduced trust in counting. By piece. Grumbling follows, and then acquiescence, because everyone agrees that shaving coins is a problem and someone must decide how to price trust. The civil service examinations which tie families to the state are standardized to a degree that would be oppressive if not for the strange dignity the ritual confers. Anonymity of scripts is enforced with covers pasted over names. A secondary scribe recopies each script in a prepared hand to foil recognition by style. On the day before the palace exam, the candidate's slippers are inspected to ensure no slips of paper are hidden in soles. The questions are practical, couched in classical language: how to schedule corvée labor on irrigation ditches without disrupting late planting, whether it is wise to allow merchants to purchase grain from government granaries during lean years. A candidate can be brilliant and still fail, just as a diligent man can pass, and families understand that error margins are baked into a system where human judgment evaluates human judgment. Even resentment becomes orderly, channeled into letters that complain about examiners' preferences rather than into fists. As the decades turn, emperors change, and with them the tone of court, but less so its structure. One sovereign is more attentive to ritual, another to the price of copper, another to a library cataloguing project that will index titles by subject as well as by author. The apparatus is designed to be resilient to such shifts. The diary office continues to record daily court sessions with a restraint that borders on dryness, because its job is not to judge but to remember. The remonstrance office continues to frame its advice in terms that a ruler can accept without humiliation, because counsel intended to sting is less likely to work. When rain fails, the petitions multiply, and when floods come, the petitions change shape, but the channels remain, like a riverbed that meanders but does not abandon its course. At the edges, things are less tranquil. On the northwestern front, steppe cavalry, testing the border force adjustments, discover that distances and supply tables cannot be perfectly tuned. A raid after an unseasonal storm reveals that a garrison on a hilltop has no dry firewood because shipment cycles assumed drier roads. The report is written, the tables corrected, the lesson absorbed, that planning must take into account variances as well as averages. Along the southeast coast, pirates learn to slip between patrols timed to the old market calendars. The transport intendant adapts, ordering patrols to use a set of lunar offsets so that no one can predict the week's quiet nights. The pattern is the same across domains. Centralization as a living thing, not a frozen plan, a habit of incorporating frictions into routine. In such a system, careers are built on small successes. A magistrate who reduces grain spoilage in county granaries by shifting storehouses from wood to brick during a dry winter earns a note in his file and a better posting. An official who standardizes ink recipes across offices so that the same seal leaves identical color regardless of batch wins an unglamorous but real improvement in verification. A transport officer who rearranges boat convoys so that heavier loads go downstream at dusk when winds die and lighter loads move at dawn gains a marginal time advantage that, repeated 100 times, turns into real savings. These are not the acts that fill epics, but If you have lived through disorder, you recognize them as the acts that keep children fed. The arts, cultivated and celebrated, are often mistaken as a distraction from this governance. In reality, the court's patronage of painters and calligraphers and poets is part of the same project. Prestige is tied to refined performance, which is tied to education, which is tied to service. A young man who can control his brush through lines of regular script can control a budget line. A man who understands rhythm in verse often understands pacing in policy. The court uses taste to select for discipline. Libraries swell with printed texts that would once have been rare, and the catalogues that organize them are compiled with the same fastidiousness as tax rolls. You sit in a bookshop and watch a clerk file a new title under categories that were devised at court: statecraft, ritual, poetry, miscellany, and you think, this is how ideas become sortable, and sorted ideas become actions. Religion, too, is organized rather than suppressed. Monasteries register land, clerics record ordinations, pilgrimage routes acquire official way stations where travelers can rest, knowing that the state understands the traffic. Priests and abbots learn to write memorials with the same formal openings as civil petitions, not because they crave bureaucratic flavor, but because that is the idiom of legitimacy. A temple that wishes to rebuild a hall makes a case about local employment and the benefits of the structure's shelter during storms. A shrine that seeks protection from nearby markets cites precedent for permit distances. The state's hand here is neither heavy nor light. It is steady, and steadiness is its own ideology. By the time the century turns, the capital's routines are so predictable that visitors can set their days by the mid-morning courier bell and the mid-afternoon audience drum. But even in this confidence, quiet anxieties persist. Copper supplies fluctuate with mining yields and long-distance trade. Counterfeiters adapt. The ratio of coin to goods must be watched in case prices begin to wander. The army is drilled and rotated, yet it must be kept strong without letting any one man gather too much personal loyalty. Examinations fill offices, yet the very standardization that brings in competent men risks producing a kind of polite conformity that hesitates when uncertainty arrives. You walk in the evening along the outer wall and consider these trade-offs, content in the city's hum, aware that contentment can become complacency. The paradox of the early northern song is that its greatest success, turning power into process, and process into habit, may have also laid the groundwork for a later brittleness. When a state becomes a machine good at keeping itself going, it is tempted to trust that improvements will always be incremental, and problems always soluble by adjustment. That temptation is reasonable most of the time, but the world includes events not amenable to gentle tuning. As a courier lopes past you with a pouch sealed in fresh red wax, you wonder how this system will react when the message inside does not fit the forms. When a river changes course, when a neighbor changes shape, when commerce explodes into new lanes and the familiar balance between interior and frontier shifts. Will the empire's layered silk hold, or will it need a stitch that has not yet been invented? You return to the capital in a different season and notice the same sounds arranged against a different light. The market lanes are warmer, the canal is thick with boats, and the drums at the watchtowers seem less crisp in the damp. Continuity is comforting, but you are here to consider what this careful order has purchased and what it has cost. The story of centralization does not end with maps neatly colored and a city humming. It unfolds in a series of adjustments that squeeze and settle like earth after a new embankment. People live inside those adjustments. Farmers who plan sowing around tax schedules, merchants who carry coin weights from town to town because they know scales will be tested, officials who time their memorials to catch a sympathetic eye before a posting decision. All of them learn to read the state's habits as if reading weather. The first fruit of that habit reading is risk reduction. Grain transport along the canal is less likely to disappear into a storm of bribes. Local violence declines where the magistrate's watch schedule is predictable. Border raids become rarer as payments and patrols establish a rhythm. The exam system's fairness convinces enough families to tie their futures to the state. That talent becomes a steady inflow rather than a sporadic gift. To live inside steady inflow is to plan farther ahead. A boat builder invests in a new methods of sealing seams because he expects to see the benefit over years. A family that once hoarded grain against the next war now sells surplus and buys a copper pot. A mason trains his son to set brick because more offices are built in brick. This is not a romantic transformation. It is a series of unexciting decisions whose cumulative effect is prosperity. The second fruit is a new kind of public sphere. When texts are printed and ideas circulate, the language in which officials talk to one another spreads outside government walls. Artisans hear their sons recite phrases about governance. Merchants quote proverbs that originated in court debates. Poets craft lines that mirror memos in argument, but not in tone. The cities fill with conversations in which the state is not simply an authority, but a topic, a thing to be discussed and described and assessed. It is, in its way, a triumph of transparency by accretion. So much paper, so many printed laws and lists and public announcements that even those who do not hold office begin to think in terms of process. Yet costs are as real as fruits. One cost is the softening of field command, the logic that deliberately avoids empowering any single general to the point of independence also dampens the state's ability to move quickly under a single will. A combined arms movement that requires expedited approval from separate channels, for fodder, for bridge repair, for the reassignment of scouts can be slowed a day here and a day there until readiness bleeds. When the border holds quiet, this cost is low. When it stirs, the cost rises. Another cost is the way central posting and short tenures can alienate local elites whose cooperation makes county administration more efficient. A magistrate who rotates out before he has fully learned the township's old disputes and riverbeds leaves behind solved problems, yes, but also unsolved relationships that a longer tenure might have settled. The most delicate cost is cultural, a preference for the elegant solution. Exams reward persuasive writing. Politics becomes the art of devising a policy that can be defended as much as implemented. Offices proliferate with the best possible intentions, oversight to guard against capture, small redundancies to guard against failure, and in the proliferation, responsibility can diffuse. A man may write a wise memorial and then discover no one owns the next step. To combat this, the centre occasionally consolidates, creating special commissions to cut across lines, and special commissions then risk becoming permanent. What began as a temporary energy becomes another station on the post road of governance, its own seals and ledgers, another place to send a petition. Nowhere is the dynamic clearer than in finance. The state needs copper coin to keep markets moving, and its own payments regular. Its mints depend on mining, trade, and the melting of older spoons and vessels. Shortages lead to measured debasements or to issuing non-copper instruments in limited form. Surpluses tempt the Treasury to expand programs that require cash disbursement. The fiscal commissions argue for and against monopolies on goods the state can manage, salt, tea, alcohol, in order to capture revenue while smoothing price shocks. Each move answers a practical need. Each move also shifts incentives in the economy, pushes artisans from one craft to another, makes smuggling more or less attractive. The success of centralized finance is that these shifts are mostly managed. The vulnerability is that should an exogenous shock arrive, crop failure over a wider band than usual, or a disruption along the coastal trade, too many levers may need to be pulled in too many places at once, and the state that dislikes concentration will need to concentrate action. It is tempting to imagine that the answer lies in the moral quality of rulers. A conscientious sovereign will listen to remonstrance, a diligent grand counsellor will prepare for contingencies, a principled censor will risk offence to correct a dangerous flattery. And indeed, the Northern song benefits from men who fit those roles, from emperors who prize learning, from ministers who treat procedure as a craft and not an obstacle. But here the architecture of centralization shows its true feature. It reduces, but does not eliminate, reliance on extraordinary virtue. In a system where even competence is widely distributed and trackable by paper trails, the line between good and mediocre governance is perceptible but narrower. That is a strength. Mediocrity can be borne for a time. It is also a subtle hazard, because mediocrity is content to do what worked yesterday. As the century moves and the empire's own weight makes it more dependent on its routines, a conviction grows among some officials that recalibration is needed more than the usual increments. Grain flows are adequate but sometimes late. Soldiers are loyal but not nimble. Coin is abundant in some places and scarce in others. The poor in certain districts do not benefit as they might from market expansion. Local security can fray where new market lanes open without corresponding watch rotations. A set of remedies will be proposed to rationalize taxes further, to make credit more available to smallholders, to deepen the mutual responsibility of households for local order, to redistribute burdens in a way that discourages hoarding of coin and land. Proposals like these do not appear from nowhere. They emerge out of the very habit of measurement the state has cultivated, the habit that notices when a schedule drifts and an incentive no longer works as intended. Debate over such proposals will not be resolved by a single audience. It will shake offices and friendships. Conservatives will argue that change disrupts the delicate balances that prevent capture. Reformers will argue that without change, the balances will deteriorate anyway under the pressure of scale and time. In the corridors, men who once agreed on procedures will disagree on aims, yet all will speak in the language of administrative prudence, the idiom the state has taught them. Families will worry that factional labels will attach to them and drag their sons' promotion prospects. The diary office will continue to record everything with the same flat hand, because that is its role, even as the contents of its pages grow sharper. If you step away from high politics and stand beside a canal, lock on a foggy morning, you can see how these arguments become physical. The lockkeeper lifts gates in the order written on a weathered board. The boatmen call to one another in a rhythm that has been honed by countless passages. A local farmer watches from the bank, his cart loaded with vegetables destined for a market whose stall fees pay for the lock's maintenance. Any change to the schedule must be written and posted. Any change to posted rules will require someone to come down from the office with a brush and a pot of new ink. Any miscopying will cause confusion and delay. It is not that change is impossible, it is that gradualism has a gravitational pull in a system so deeply anchored to text. The reformer's impatience will have to express itself in memos as careful as the status quo's defenses. There is a lesson in the empire's capacity to absorb shocks through procedure. When floods strike the lower valleys, grain caches are opened on a rotation dictated by spoilage estimates, not accusations and pleadings. When a local militia proves insufficient, the centre adjusts the stipends for nearby garrisons rather than throwing a favourite general into the fray. When a counterfeit coin ring is discovered, the mints alter dies and weight standards. When a famine drives people toward the city, temples and offices organize porridge kitchens on schedules that correspond to watch changes to avoid night panic. The idea that order can be preserved and suffering mitigated without resorting to spectacle is a mature achievement. It requires patience and trust in the cumulative effect of small corrections. The same patience, viewed from a different angle, looks like hesitation. Reports on northern horse herds show a decline in the animal's stamina. A plan to revitalize breeding gets filed behind proposals to repair a dam and to reassign a censor. While the files queue, a neighboring power recalibrates faster with a new cavalry doctrine. Merchants complain that coin shortages in certain circuits are hampering trade. The Treasury releases more copper eastward but holds back westward because of mining output unpredictability. The imbalance persists long enough to harden into habit. Habits become structural. In such moments, you feel the weight of a system designed to keep pressure evenly distributed, and you wonder whether it can place more weight quickly where it is needed without cracking any of its own beams. It is easy to be wise after the fact. From where you stand in the narrative, moving along with the century, the future is not a ledger, but a rumor. What you can say with confidence is that the Northern Song's centralization has created a world in which millions can expect predictability. Children are born with better odds of growing to adulthood. Farmers can gamble less on weather because they can gamble a little more on markets. Artisans can specialize because customers can find them. Officials can be trained to a baseline of competence that makes even dull governors acceptable. This is not a small achievement, and it shapes the character of a civilization. You leave the capital by the south gate and travel for days along roads whose milestones are marked and whose post stations keep bedding washed and set aside for couriers. Villages gather grain for tax days. Towns print notices about bridge repairs. Cities hum into the night with legal markets. The empire is a coordinated set of routines that allow for life beyond survival. In the distance, other rhythms are forming. Trade winds that will pull ships along sea lanes, new crops that will change planting cycles, printing houses that will multiply texts beyond what examination halls alone can digest. The architecture of control will need to flex around these forces or risk being pushed by them. So you arrive at the edge of this first story and hold in your mind two images: a well-run office where a scribe ties a neat string around a file and places it in the correct cubby, and a border fort where a horse shifts its weight, impatient, sensing a wind that carries scents its rider does not yet recognize. Between file and horse lies the question that will carry you into the next story. Can a state built around procedures fold vast new energies, commerce, credit, coastal trade, into its quiet schedules without losing the very stability that made those energies possible? You begin again, this time not in the capital, but in a lowland where water moves lazily through ditches etched by generations of hands. The transformation that will define this age is not a single invention, but a suite of improvements that fit each other like joints in a wooden frame. Paddies are leveled with care that looks like devotion. Bunds are reinforced after each rainy season with mud treaded by barefoot labor. Sluice gates are carved from wood and braced with iron nails bought at markets that did not exist a century earlier. If you want to understand prosperity, watch a farmer in early spring squat on a narrow ridge, squint, and judge whether the slope needs another shaving to make water pool evenly. This is the kind of adjustment that yields a handful more. Grain per moo multiplied by thousands of fields. The empire's strength grows from such gestures repeated by people whose names do not travel far beyond their village. New varieties of rice reach these fields and change the tempo of life. Early ripening strains allow double cropping in places where only one harvest was practical before. The short stalks resist lodging. The grain tolerates periods of dryness between rains. The effect is not immediate wealth, it is margin. A family that once counted the gap between harvest and harvest in days now finds slack enough to sell a portion without fear. With slack comes choice. A daughter can be freed from constant weeding to learn to reel silk. A son can carry surplus to market without leaving the field dangerously unattended. An elder can retreat from daily labor to manage repairs and timing. The household remains fragile, but less so, and fragility is the difference between desperation and planning. The taxi system adapts to this, not out of benevolence but out of practicality. Taxes expressed in grain and labor are increasingly commuted into cash, because cash allows the state to move value more flexibly, to buy grain where it is cheap and send it where it is needed, to pay for the services of men whose skills are not easily conscripted. To turn grain into cash without ruining farmers requires markets regular enough that prices are not ruinous. To make markets regular requires infrastructure that looks humble but is transformative, tamped earth roads on the right side of levees, bridges with wooden rails that survive one flood more than the last generations, stone platforms by the river for loading that keep sacks out of the mud. Every improvement has a cost in labor and material, and rural people shoulder much of it, but the rewards return to them in the form of predictable prices and fewer lost days. Agricultural diversification rides on these rails. Along the edges of rice paddies, market gardens sprout vegetables, greens that bolt quickly in heat, radishes for pickling, melons trellised along fences. In slightly higher ground, dry fields carry wheat and millet to hedge against rice failures. In slopes, above, tea bushes root in soils perfected by habit. Mulberry planted along ditches feeds silkworms, and the rhythm of leaf-picking and worm-feeding fits between transplanting rice and weeding, another joint in the time structure of the farm. Oil presses appear in market towns, processing rapeseed and sesame. The press owner keeps books that record not only oil delivered, but press cake owed back to farmers for use as fertilizer. Such exchanges are miniature economies nested within the larger one, and they train minds to think in contracts and schedules. Water management is an art, and like all arts, it becomes a matter of instruction as well as intuition. County offices keep notebooks, no one would call them textbooks, that record the widths of ditches that work in certain soils, the seasonal calendar of sluice opening for the last 10 years, the names of men who know how to repair a weir in a hurry. These notebooks sit next to the registers of households and acreage, because to administer land taxes without knowing water is foolish, and the song is many things but rarely foolish about systems that produce grain. In dry years, irrigation rotations are posted so that neighborhoods take turns, and penalties for stealing water at night are enforced gently but visibly. In wet years, drainage ditches are cleared with corvée labor calculated to avoid peak. Transplanting days, you notice how concern for timing suffuses these practices. The point is not only to levy but to smooth, not to command but to keep flows laminar. Inside the farmstead, prosperity is measured in objects: an iron ploughshare that holds an edge better than the old bronze, a shovel with a shaft of hardwood that flexes without breaking, a stack of baskets woven tight enough that rice does not sift out during carrying, a jar of oil sealed against rodents, a loom sturdy enough to keep tension for a finer cloth. The household's calendar is recorded on a notched stick hung by the kitchen door. The debts owed and owed to are marked with knots on a cord or inked on a scrap tied to a beam. Cash strings hang from a peg, and the family argues in low voices about whether to exchange a string for a piglet or for a better blade. These are unremarkable arguments, but they are the calls of an economy whose reach extends into rooms that once survived on barter and hope. Markets knit the rural into something more than itself. On 5th days, or every 10th, depending on local custom, a city of stalls erects itself in the open. Farmers carry trays of eggs, bundles of greens, sacks of grain. Women bring combs and cloth to trade. Men who specialize in sharpening tools set up grindstones and compete with their feet, pumping out rhythm. A stall fee is collected by a man with a badge, and he is as important to the economy as any minister, because the fee funds the cleaning of gutters and the maintenance of the well and the patrol that keeps night thieves away. The market office posts the fee and the times when the bell will be rung to signal closing. At night, the market collapses back into a field. Each reappearance trains buyers and sellers in expectation, which is the soul of commerce. Credit changes hands in invisible weights. A trusted neighbor lends a string of coins for seed on the understanding that repayment comes after the first harvest. A merchant advances iron tools in exchange for grain at an agreed price. A money changer accepts the risk of weighing shaved coins and takes a spread that is public enough to be disliked and necessary enough to be sustained. Informal cooperatives arise within clans, pooling risk against illness and flood. Village elders arbitrate disputes over terms with a preference for compromise that preserves the ability to trade tomorrow. The state watches from a distance, not indifferent but aware that it cannot replace every mechanism of trust with a stamped document. Where it does intervene, outlawing certain usurious practices, encouraging local granaries to lend grain at low rates in bad years, it does so with attention to custom, because custom is a form of capital. Tools change as if invisibly, and yet you can see them. Iron production increases not because court poets love metallurgy, but because demand pulls ore from hills. Bellows are improved. Charcoal is made more efficiently from coppiced wood. Smiths organize apprenticeships that pass down guardline. Secrets: how to temper this edge in water that has boiled and cooled, how to hammer at a speed that sets the crystals in a way that resists chipping. The iron hoe you hold in your hand is not a symbol. It is an explanation for why the ridge between paddies can be cut straighter, why the weeds can be uprooted faster, why the field can be kept more level and the water managed better. From such tools come increments. From increments, wealth. If you want a human picture of the rural economy, watch a tax day in a healthy county. Families arrive at the office with grain, with coins, with receipts. Clerks weigh sacks, a checker with an abacus moves beads and calls out numbers to another who dips his brush and records. The line is long but moves because the office has calibrated the number of scales and tables to the expected turnout. A woman hands over a string of coins. The clerk tests it on a scale. A question arises about whether the count should be by number or weight. The clerk consults the posted notice. The woman nods, not pleased, but reassured that the rules are known. A young man asks for a copy of his receipt to be used at the market. The clerk cuts a scrap from a rejected petition, writes in a practiced hand, sands it to dry, and hands it over with a seal. The exchange is short, formal, almost impersonal, and because of that, oddly humane. Disaster, when it comes, reveals the strengths and limits of this system. A flood that cuts across neighborhoods forces adjustments. Emergency repairs to dikes are ordered and staffed with labor calculated to avoid stripping the fields of hands. The county granary opens and distributes on a schedule that prioritizes households with infants and the elderly. The market shifts to higher ground and posts temporary stall assignments. The magistrate publicly reads a set of remissions for taxes. Due. All of this is familiar because it builds on existing habits. What cannot be mitigated is grief, and the grief is real. But even grief is addressed by routine. Temple kitchens fire cauldrons at hours that the watch calls out. Line lengths are limited to avoid crushes. Names are taken so that repeaters do not starve neighbors. The dullness of schedule becomes an act of mercy. These practices feed the city not only with food but with people. Rural families send sons to apprentice as clerks or joiners. Daughters marry into urban craft households. Cousins take positions as porter captains in market guilds. Movement becomes a feature of life, not an emergency. The canals and roads are arteries, and the countryside pulses into the city and back. You see this in the travelling tool menders, who move from county to county as the seasons dictate repair needs, and in the travelling singers who bring news and laughter with their songs. These small mobilities add up to a world in which information moves almost as freely as goods, and where the rural and urban do not face each other as strange. At night, in a farmhouse on the edge of a county town, the family eats a plain meal. Rice, mixed with millet, pickled greens, a sliver of pork brewed in soy, and then counts its coins under the lamplight. They talk about whether to buy a better rake or to save for a mule, whether to send the second son to the county school to try his hand at characters, whether to lease a half plot from a neighbour who is aging and cannot farm as hard. The conversation is not dramatic, but it holds quiet ambition. The empire's economy has made such talk possible by making tomorrow more predictable than yesterday. You can hear in the low voices a bet being made that the rules posted at the office will be there next year, that the market bell will ring at the same hour, that floods, when they come, will be met not by panic, but by procedure. You walk out, under a sky with few lamps and many stars, and think about the limits of this order. Weather can fail, pests can descend, trade can be interrupted by war, prices can wobble when mint outputs change, social trust can fray when a bad magistrate is posted. The rural engine of prosperity is resilient but not invulnerable. Its strength is that it shares its burdens through clan nets, village compacts, market routines, and the state's calibrated remissions. Its vulnerability is that it assumes a degree of continuity, and continuity, like water, can be diverted. As the night insects buzz and a dog turns twice before lying down, you wonder, how will this careful rural machine respond when paper itself becomes money, when ships carry goods faster than carts can roll, and when the city's appetite grows beyond anything the old schedules were designed to feed? You arrive in the city at dusk, when the air softens and lamps bloom along the lanes like small, ordinary stars. It is at this hour that the practicality of prosperity reveals itself. Shops lift their shutters halfway to let in the evening cool, and keep the lamps from sputtering, and the streets fill with a steady flow of people returning from counting houses and river quays. You smell oil from frying dough, see strings of copper coin looped around wrists, and hear the scraping sound of scales checking the weight of a handful of fish. The city was once a daylight thing. Now, under a dynasty that decided markets could be trusted in the night so long as they were numbered and licensed, it has become a place where trade lengthens the day. You move between stalls and watch trust accumulate in increments. A vendor lays out a permit with a worn corner, a watchman nods and taps the copper tag, and a transaction becomes routine rather than risk. Inside a cloth shop, bolts of unrolled silk reveal the everyday texture of growth. The proprietor knows where each came from, not through romance but through record. He can tell you which county's mulberry leaves produced the cocoon that produced the thread that became this bolt, and he can do it in a voice more accounting than lyrical. Comparisons are calm and specific. A tighter weave from the hill town, a paler dye set in a river that runs cleaner in winter, a cheaper but serviceable piece from a village whose worms were rushed through 2 feed cycles. Buyers run fingers over the surfaces and then look at the tally slips, knowing that purchase is not simply a matter of touch, but of the shop's ability to stand behind the cloth in spring when the stitching gets stress. Behind the counter is a bound book that records each sale with date, name, and measure, because profit is repeatable only when memory does not depend on breath alone. If you want to understand why paper matters here, go to the counting house at the back. The room is small and plain, a table with abacus beads smoothed from years of thumbs, an inkstone still wet from the last calculation, and a stack of thin brown sheets cut to a standard size that lets them fit into baskets without curling. On these sheets are receipts, loans, and promissory notes, small declarations that value can travel without grain on a boat or coin in a sack. When a merchant sends goods upriver, he writes 2 pieces of paper, one to travel with the shipment, and another to remain behind, each with a seal pressed at an angle that makes forgery inconvenient. The city's discipline lies in such angles. Trust does not come from a brave face or an oath in a shrine. It comes from a folding pattern that makes a document easy to check and a notation system that tells a clerk where to find the reference. Copy in a shelf of 90 baskets. Walk to the money changer's stall and you can see the limits of coin. Copper is heavy and tangible, but it travels slowly and accumulates costs with every knot in the string. The money changer weighs and tests coins, separating shaved and clipped pieces into a bowl that clinks dull, and assigning to each a small discount announced in a patient voice that brooks no argument. Alongside the coins, you see paper instruments, local, notes that entitle the bearer to withdraw coin in a different ward, or to settle a debt at a scheduled time. These are not the fully fledged paper currencies that later generations will debate. They are more modest, the habit behind the habit, a training in the idea that value can be guaranteed by system rather than by touch. In the city's larger shops, you hear rumors of experiments with more formal notes, guaranteed by reputable associations, and you catch a glimpse of a future where the hand that writes a good script will matter as much as the hand that builds a strong hull. Markets, licensing, and timekeeping transform the night. Watchmen walk with staves and lanterns, stopping at intersections where drum posts mark the hour with a code of beats. The drums are not military in tone, they are municipal. Signals to shopkeepers to lower lamps or lift shutters according to posted rules. In neighborhoods adjacent to temples and schools, the rules are stricter. Quieter voices, fewer stalls. In warehouse wards by the river, the rules allow longer hours because boats arrive on their own schedule. The city has learned to grade quiet and noise like an exam, awarding more leeway to places where trade must move and insisting on restraint where sleep and study are the goods being protected. You take comfort in this ordinariness the way a code posted on a wall translates into a guard's leisurely patrol and a stallkeeper's practiced extinguishing of a lamp with a pinch. Commerce pulls along with it a mass of city crafts that are loyal to neither glamour nor spectacle. Behind a tea house, coopers cork barrels with pitch, their hands stained, and their talk concerned with shrinkage rates through seasons. In a lane of metalworkers, a man hammers knife edges with a steady rhythm, quenching in a bucket whose water he replaces according to a habit that borders on superstition and is actually craft memory. In a row of apothecaries, assistants grind rhubarb root and cinnamon and meticulously keep labels upright so they can be read even in poor light. A city becomes truly prosperous when these trades enjoy steady orders. The apothecary's ledger records more requests for travel powders because people are moving more. The cooper's books show orders from guilds that ship vinegar and oil. The knife maker notes that buyers now ask for a cheaper second knife to keep in a kitchen outside. The main room. This complexity is not dramatic. It is the density that makes life stable. You pass through the entertainment quarter, where prosperity gathers in a more obvious, if less comfortable way. Storytellers perform for coins tossed into wooden bowls. Waterside pavilions host singers and musicians. Food vendors sell skewers of seasoned meat whose smell turns heads from 3 stalls away. It is easy to caricature this as frivolity, but observe the structure. The quarter is permitted within a boundary marked by posts. Guards from the watch station walk a pattern that they adjust by the night's heat. A guild of performers keeps a record of who sang when, distributing prime hours in a rotation that prevents fights. The food stalls have water jars set out at intervals, with fines posted for failure to keep them clean. Pleasure is scheduled because scheduling reduces fights over scarcity. The city's preference for small rules makes even this seem less like vice than like the management of crowd flow. Printing and bookshops bind the city's mind to its pockets. In some streets, shelves spill over with reprinted classics, primers for boys, collections of poems, legal handbooks for minor officials, and manuals on tasks as unromantic as bridge repair or distilling vinegar. It is not a miracle that these books exist. It is a system. The printers buy paper in bulk and keep a reserve of ink cakes that can be softened with a kettle set on a charcoal brazier. They pay readers to check proofs. They reuse blocks carefully, wrapping them in cloth and stacking them in the shallow back room. Buyers come with specific needs: a book of models for writing letters to superiors, a guide to the city's market days and expected prices in each quarter, a digest of laws relevant to merchants. Reading shifts from a noble pursuit to a tool, and with that shift, literacy seeps into households where once only one person held a brush with confidence. You sense in this the human side of growth, the aunt who can now write a list for her nephew to take to market, the apprentice who copies a contract by hand and understands its lines rather than parroting. Food in the city is a logistics problem. Solved with affection. Granaries supply rice, yes, but kitchens need more than grain. The vegetable sellers arrange their baskets by price and by spoilage rate, pushing the quick wilting greens before the sturdier roots, because waste is money turning into smell. Fish from the river are gutted on boards that slope to channels, that drain into the lane's gutter, and the gutter has been paved in stone so that it can be scrubbed. Soy sauce and vinegar arrive in barrels sealed by Cooper's art. Tofu is delivered in trays, nestled in damp cloth to keep it cool. The layout of the city itself aids the flow. Certain lanes are known for their clean pumps, others for their generous shade at noon. The watch changes are timed so that storekeepers know when help will pass by for lifting a heavy load. None of this is heroic, but it is the kind of orchestration that lets people eat better and worry less. In the shadow of prosperity are operations designed to keep failure from becoming disaster. Pawnshops are part of this fabric, lending cash against tools and garments when a month runs long. The pawnbroker's reputation is measured not only by his rates, but by his fairness in holding goods to the promised term, his practice of letting borrowers buy back in small increments, and his willingness to sell a pledged item at a fair market time rather than dumping it into a glut. His books are clean because an angry client is not merely a lost customer, but a crack in neighborhood trust. Charity granaries, often linked to temples or administered by local compacts, keep a rotation of millet and rice that serves as a buffer. In good years, they lend at low rates to the poor, and in bad, they suspend repayment schedules and distribute porridge in the morning when lines are shorter and tempers less frayed. You notice how charity and accounting live together without strangeness. Here, guilds shape work not as monopolies of glamour but as guardians of process. Porters' guilds assign loads by rotation. Boatmen's guilds set standards for rope quality and punish members who put passengers at risk by overloading. Carpenters' guilds maintain rules for timber storage to prevent fires, requiring distances between stacks and mandating water jars at the corners. These rules are posted as simple wood boards with inked characters that anyone can read if his schooling took. Enforcement is quiet and persistent. A porter who breaks rotation must carry for free the next 2 loads. A boatman who overloads must return his fares and loses line priority. A carpenter found with an unwatered timber corner sweeps the market lane for a week. It is the discipline of chores, not the drama of prisons. Somewhere in the network, experiments with paper finance take a bolder form. In certain cities, deposit shops issue notes, vouchers redeemable for coin, whose convenience is both obvious and frightening. Ordinary people describe them with metaphors, calling them feathers that fly farther than copper or skins stretched over coin. Not everyone trusts them, and cautious people continue to insist on real coin for large purchases. Yet you can feel the city beginning to rehearse for an economy where paper, backed by reputation and office, will circulate alongside copper. Shopkeepers post their policies about which notes they accept, pinned to wooden pillars near the cash stand, and money changers hone their skill in sniffing counterfeit ink and feeling the grit of inferior paper. The feeling is not of revolution, but of another small wedge of convenience inserted into habits that already value schedule and verification. At the edge of the city, the river turns wide and domestic, with cranes hunched like modest elders on barges. Warehouses sit with their doors high above the ground to avoid floods. Ramps are laid when boats come. Goods are checked in by a man, holding a bamboo clipboard and a brush cut short to keep its tip firm. He marks each sack and crate with characters that tell a story more reliable than memory. Origin, contents, weight, time of arrival, and intended next step. The clerk does not care about the poetry of the shipment. Porcelain bowls as thin as eggshell, ironware hammered in a rhythm learned from a grandfather, because he knows that romance delays, and that delay has costs measured in bales of mold and jars gone sour. You watch and realize that the city's soul is not roasted chestnuts and poems sung in an upper room. It is the character for received written 1,000 times with a consistent hand. As night deepens, you move away from the lit lanes and listen to the city's low noises. Somewhere a saw whispers, finishing a cut before the lamp must be trimmed. Somewhere a mother counts coins under her breath for a child's school fees. Somewhere an apprentice dips a brush in the thinnest of ink to practice characters without wasting the good cakes. Prosperity sounds like this: routine maintained after dusk, ambition expressed in small purchases, risk managed through posted rules, and the unfussy enforcement of predictable penalties. You lie down in a guest house whose bedding is clean because the guild that supplies it keeps standards, and whose door has a latch, whose weight the landlord has weighed so that the wind cannot shake it into clatter. You think not in grand metaphors, but in lists: lamp, latch, ledger, ladle. And then you ask yourself the question that a city poised between coin and paper must answer. When convenience accelerates and notes begin to flutter farther than boats can row, will the discipline of schedule and seal be enough to keep trust from tearing in the first strong gust? You go down river until river gives way to sea, and the air changes from silt to salt. The port is not a mythic place of treasure and pirates. It is a grid of wooden piers, sheds with roofs repaired at the end of each rainy season, and office, windows where officials sit with brushes and bell-metal seals. Ships come in shapes that look inevitable, high-sterned, broad-beamed, ribbed with ribs you can see if you catch sight of a hull pulled for repair. They carry bulk first: rice, salt, ceramics, iron, timber. At their edges are the small things that ride alongside profitably because someone had the habit of filling space: bamboo fans, combs, paper sheets kept dry between oiled cloth. The port's tempo is not only the hails of sailors or the cawing of gulls, it is the methodical shuffling of cargo lists and the soft thud of seals impressed in wax on documents that will accompany goods along their next leg. A port is a customs house before it is a romance. Officials at the harbour office keep tables. That list duties and exemptions. Certain goods, the salt that feeds the state, the tea that fills its coffers, are subject to special handling. Other goods pass with a fee calculated to be tolerable rather than oppressive, because a fee people will pay is better than a fee that births smuggling. On the counter, a clerk keeps a basket of coins for change and an abacus for the arithmetic. That would look trivial if 20 ships did not arrive the same afternoon. The forms are printed in advance, and the spaces to fill are fixed. Ship name, captain, origin, tonnage, principal cargo, and declared route. Routine produces fairness more effectively than exhortation. A captain who knows what he will owe plans better. A clerk who checks forms with a practiced eye reduces someone's opportunity to slip forbidden cargo through with a friendly grin. Shipwright's work reveals the city's priorities. They build hulls with compartments separated by watertight bulkheads, a technique that turns one disaster into an inconvenience and many inconveniences into routine maintenance. They shape and hang sternpost rudders whose size speaks to the mast they can steer, and they set masts at positions honed by experience to balance speed and stability. In the yard, a master walks with a boy who counts planks, and you can tell that the lesson is as much counting as it is planning. The master explains how to order timber in winter when it is cheap, how to stack it to season well, and how to schedule the labor so that the team's strength is used on the days when the frame must be lifted and joined. What looks like craft is also calendar. Knowing when to ask for help, when to set aside a piece that must wait for the right day, and when to tell a captain that delivery will be later than his ambition wishes. Maritime knowledge transforms from trick to system. Compasses appear, not as magic wands but as tools that make routes repeatable. Sailors talk of lodestone needles floated on bamboo splinters, of directions marked with characters on small boards, of the comfort of knowing where south lies when cloud and night erase landmarks. Alongside the compass are low-key improvements that matter as much, better maps of coastlines with careful attention to inlets where shelter can be found, simple guides that describe sea lanes in terms of days and customary winds rather than degrees that few can track at night. Instructions for ballasting cargo so that when a squall hits, a ship will ride rather than roll. Merchant families invest in these improvements because they know that predictable voyages lower insurance in the old sense, fewer cousins waiting on jetties for news of sons. Trade extends beyond empire as a matter of habit, not conquest. The port handles envoys and private traders with the same tools, counters for declarations, warehouses for storage, and a trusted handful of translators whose value is measured less by language elegance than by the consistency with which they render measures and money. Goods from the south and west arrive, spices whose aromas irritate the noses of officials who must still assess them, hardwoods that smell like resin and end up in small luxury furniture, ivory and frankincense that go to temples and noble houses. In return, move porcelain strong enough to survive long journeys, ironware that serves as a universal language of durability, and paper that, once seen, tends to become desired. You notice that even this far-projected commerce is a series of small accommodations. A note on how to pack jars so that they do not knock, a decision to wrap paper in oiled cloth against waves, a rule about how many bundles a porter can carry at once so that docks remain passable. You find yourself in a courtyard schoolyard at dawn when ink slabs are ground with the same soft patience as rice is washed. Boys sit on benches with backs straight and brushes held at an angle that a teacher corrects with a tap. This is education as daily practice, not romantic illumination. The classics are recited, yes, but always with an eye to use, passages on righteous rule, accompanied by questions about irrigation rotations, exhortations to filial piety followed by scenarios about how to settle a dispute over boundary stones. The school is not lavish, it is orderly. A board lists lessons for the week, a niche holds extra brushes. A jar of sand sits ready to dry characters quickly when pages must be stacked. Parents come by to look at posted results with expressions that mix pride and calculation because they know that each character written clearly could be a rung on a ladder to a desk where weather becomes policy. The road from school to office goes through the examination system, a machine of selection as polished as the desks that fill its halls. Where earlier centuries relied on recommendation and rank, this century insists on performance judged against models. The county exam feeds the prefectural, which feeds the metropolitan, which feeds the palace exam where the emperor himself presides, ranking the top finishers with his own brush. The details are unglamorous and fierce. Scripts are anonymized by pasted covers. Then they are recopied by clerks to frustrate recognition by handwriting. Then they are judged by men who have written model answers that circulate afterward to set a standard. The questions are as much about procedure as about moral posture. How to staff corvée labor so that roads can be repaired without crippling. Planting. How to price grain when a county granary opens during a flood. How to handle a lawsuit in which both parties are wrong without wrecking their ability to live next door tomorrow. Families organize around these cycles with the same devotion that others bring to harvest. A mother tallies the cost of paper and ink cakes. A father debates whether to sell a mule to finance a son's longer stay in the capital. An uncle argues for steady progress over brilliance. Lodgings in exam cities rent rooms with good light, and a niche for water to settle the ink. Landladies acquire a reputation for keeping lamps trimmed and beeswax cheap. Shops near examination halls stock food that keeps during long sessions, cakes that don't crumble into ink, dried fruits that don't stain fingers. On the eve of the exam, rules are read out with grave boredom. No slips tucked into slippers, no notes pasted under the table, no whispers with neighbors. The point is not suspicion, the point is fairness through predictability, the virtue that this state prizes because it yields trust that endures beyond a single just man's lifetime. The content of what these students study shows a civilization's inner preferences. Alongside the canonical texts are commentaries that lean into practicality, discussions about tax registers and the meanings of administrative terms, debates about the proper measure of leniency in sentencing, and the ethics of compulsion in gathering labor after a flood. Poetry is not ornament, it is a training in control. A man who can shape a line within the rules of rhyme and tone can write an order that says exactly what it must and nothing more. Calligraphy is not art, it is discipline at a glance. A magistrate's docket looks like a painting when written by a steady hand, and that steadiness signals to everyone who reads it that the person behind the brush will not be swayed by hurry or fear. Once a degree is earned, the world contracts and expands at once. The new official receives a posting, often to a county where he knows no one, and learns the craft of governance among ledgers, seals, and the cold knowledge that someone else's family now depends on his ability to read a river in spring. He lives in a compound where the Yamen gate swings with a particular creak in wet weather, and the jail smells of straw and iron. His days are not those of a sage extolling virtue to awed crowds. They are those of a manager of flows. He hears cases in the morning when tempers are low. He checks granary inventories when shadows are long, because cooler air favors counting. He meets with village elders to learn which men can be trusted with night watches and which fields flood first. He writes reports in a hand that his superiors will understand, because clarity in a distant office becomes relief or confusion in a living village. The bureaucratic culture that shapes him is built from instruments designed to foster courage, of a particular sort, the courage to follow process under pressure. Remonstrance offices exist to scold emperors in a tone that can be accepted. The diary office exists to record court sessions for posterity in a voice that neither flatters nor condemns. Censorial officials travel to inspect magistrates and report abuses, and the best of them are as committed to boring fairness as to dramatic exposure. This culture is self-conscious. It knows that power tends to poetry toward bold gestures, and it trains itself to prefer the steadiness that makes justice repeatable. In that sense, the life of the mind in this time is not about dazzling originality, but about the precise repetition of good habits. Books make this repetition easier and broader. Government presses and private printers flood the country with compilations, model memorials that teach the idiom of successful requests. Administrative encyclopedias that list everything a county official is likely to need, from the right ratio of straw to mud for dike repair, to precedents for dealing with temples that crowd markets. Legal digests that translate the Great Code into practical terms for daily use. A poor student can buy a thin book of model letters and with practice produce a memorial that will be read without disgust. A well-born student with better access to collections can read divergent commentaries and learn to argue within tradition. The effect is less a flattening than a raising of the floor, a civic literacy that spreads outward from courts and schools to shops and farms. Not all of this is peaceful. Competition is intense because the rewards of office are real: salary, prestige, influence in marriage markets, and the chance to nudge the lives of thousands toward order or away from it. Factions form, sometimes on principle and sometimes on personality, and students learn early to avoid casual remarks that could attach an unwanted label to their names. Yet the system's preference for procedure acts as a cushion. Disputes are fought in memorials rather than in militias. Slights are recorded in postings rather than in blood. Families encourage their sons to cultivate friendships across lines, and inns near the examination halls become floating salons where men tease one another for their favorite commentators while sharing lamps and water. The culture of governance reaches into households in kinder ways too. County schools extend beyond boys seeking degrees. They teach basic characters to sons of artisans and smallholders, enough literacy to read a posted notice and copy a receipt. Temple schools do the same, folding reading into lessons about community compact and charity. Women's literacy grows in uneven but noticeable patches, especially in cities where merchants' households value the ability to keep accounts and write letters to trading partners. In the evenings, a mother and son may practice characters. Together, the mother focused on numbers and the son on phrases from the classics. These scenes are far from dramatic, but they carry the shape of a society that believes order can be taught. You spend a morning in a yamen and see the state's temperament up close. Petitioners arrive in the order posted: elders first, then women with children, then men whose disputes are likely to end in shouting if kept waiting. The magistrate hears a case about a boundary stone that migrated after a flood, sends runners to check the old maps in the storehouse, and delays judgment until the afternoon when the sun will fall in a way that reveals the slope. He settles an argument over a loan with a ruling that splits the difference and includes a suggestion that the men enter their next agreement with a witness from the market office. He orders 2 men who fought at a wine stall to sweep the market lane under watch for a week and pays for new dippers out of a petty cash fund. Nothing is dramatic, and yet the city breathes a little easier for the dullness of the outcomes. Scholarship is not divorced from administration. It feeds it. Commentators write essays that reframe the classics in light of new problems. How to think about wealth when coin circulates more quickly than grain. How to reconcile a preference for self-sufficient farmers with the reality that markets require specialization. how to recognize merit when printing allows many to sound learned. Debates are framed in terms of first principles and then tested against the reality of a flooded valley or a stubborn deficit in a circuit's accounts. Emperors read, or at least pretend to, ministers argue, the recorders record. Across the empire, clerks in small offices absorb the ripples as changes in form templates, seal placements, and audit timetables. At night, you page through a student's copybook and see the marks of ambition, lines copied until they grow steady, policy arguments rehearsed at different lengths, quotations tucked into margins with notes about how to deploy them. This is a quiet heroism, the willingness to press one's life into the shape of a process in the belief that the process makes the world fairer. It is also a gamble against chaos, that stability earned by brush can resist disturbance by blade. You turn the last page and wonder, with a sympathy that has no sarcasm, whether this civilization's love of order will be nimble enough when demands suddenly require more than careful repetition. When the next question in the exam cannot be answered by a model because the world has changed its terms overnight. And if that night arrives during a storm, will the ink that has held this society together blur? Or will it prove stubbornly, beautifully, water-resistant? You wake to a magistrate's morning and feel how governance is chore, not lecture. The day begins with petitions sorted by urgency, flood reports flagged by reed slips at the top, disputes over debt and property in a middle heap, requests for licenses and certificates making a low hill on the desk. The office runners know their routes and their thresholds for discretion. They carry the same face to rich and poor and prefer to resolve without writing if they can. The magistrate moves through tasks at a pace that balances thoroughness against the time's demands. He cannot afford to luxuriate in a single case. He cannot afford to hurry through them all. This discipline looks like good manners. It is actually triage taught by habit. Law is not a fog of maxims. It is a code with commentaries, a living tool. The magistrate references the Great Code as amended, checks the digest for precedents, and then writes reasons in the modest prose that governance favors. A case involving assault at a market stall comes with testimony from 3 witnesses and a note from a guild head. The magistrate reads aloud the penalty for the specific offence and then adjusts for provocation and context as permitted, indicating why in the record the men are punished lightly and put to work sweeping, their faces saved by the fact that punishment is public but not theatrical. The code permits this blend of rule and discretion, and the culture encourages a tone that avoids humiliation when possible, because men who can bear a verdict are likelier to accept it and go on living alongside their neighbors. Infrastructure is where policy becomes earth. Dike maintenance schedules are posted each spring with names assigned to segments. Corvée labor is organized with a sensitivity to planting times so that families are not stripped of hands when seedlings are fragile. When a breach occurs, the emergency plan is neither genius nor chaos. Runners bring men and baskets, a foreman trained in 2 previous floods directs shoveling, and the magistrate visits briefly not to inspire but to verify. Are the baskets at the right place? Is the straw being layered as recommended? Have watchers been placed upstream to warn of new weaknesses? Afterward, the record reflects not only that the breach was closed, but how long it took and which recommendations from last year were followed or ignored. Improvement enters as a line in a ledger before it ever becomes a visible change on the ground. Revenue collection is as delicate as it is necessary. The magistrate knows the yield of a county in coin and grain because he has received the circuit's expectations and because he has his own eyes. To squeeze too hard is to invite flight and fraud. To squeeze too little is to invite reprimand and insolvency. The tax office posts rates, rotates weighers to prevent cozy arrangements, and inspects scales with a set of standard weights that the clerks guard like talismans. Commutation into cash is encouraged because it makes value portable, but grain is still accepted because granaries must be kept ready. When rumours of shaved coins spread, the magistrate adopts a policy of counting by weight rather than number for strings, explaining the decision in a posted notice that emphasizes fairness. Clarity is treated as a public good. Dispute resolution is a daily discipline. A boundary conflict triggers the opening of a cupboard of maps drawn in earlier years. The magistrate sends a clerk with a measuring rope and a witness from each side to pace the land and return with agreed numbers. A loan default case leads to a conversation about the terms written in a small hand on the back of a receipt, and the magistrate uses a model contract from the office's files to elucidate where both parties went sloppy. Divorce petitions, rare but real, are handled with care, often in a side room where voices can lower and the language of mediation can be used without loss of face. The magistrate's aim is not merely a decision, but an end to the matter, so that it does not return in a different mask. The local elite is both partner and pressure. Village elders know where water stagnates, which families carry hidden burdens, whose sons keep night hours that lead to fights. They expect respect and offer counsel. Sometimes they expect favors, and the magistrate must say no with a tone that makes return visits possible. Temples stand as both conscience and institution. They run porridge kitchens in lean times, maintain bridges with donations, and provide ritual calendars that shape labor availability. The magistrate coordinates with abbots, drafting notices that acknowledge festivals while encouraging staggered participation so that markets and patrols can function. Religion becomes another rhythm to integrate, not a rival score to drown out. The censorate's eye occasionally falls on the county. An inspector arrives unannounced if the central mood is suspicious, announced if it trusts local officials to preen. The best magistrates do neither. They present books that are clean without being obviously remade, produce clerks whose hands show ink in the right places, and invite the inspector to speak with men in the market without chaperones. If faults are found, they are often faults of degree. A corvée rotation that leaned too hard on a certain neighborhood, a granary that failed to rotate stock on time, a guard post whose lamps were not refilled on schedule. Corrections are made and recorded. The magistrate's career survives because the system knows the difference between lackeys and fraud, and because a man who can admit error and translate it into a better schedule is valuable. Higher politics infiltrates in the form of policy packages. Orders arrive from the capital to try new methods, to register households in groups that take collective responsibility for security and tax compliance, to extend low-interest grain, loans in spring to dampen usury, to train horse breeding in certain districts to revitalize cavalry remounts. The magistrate implements as best he can, often adjusting for local terrain. He might organize mutual responsibility units around natural neighborhoods rather than artificial lines, so that the rule has a chance to live. He might coordinate spring loans through temples because their record-keeping is trustworthy and their moral authority discourages default. He must write reports that describe not only compliance but effectiveness because superiors hunger for stories that translate policy into human outcomes. Printing helps here too. Manuals arrive that explain new measures, complete with table layouts for registers, sample forms, and lists of common mistakes. The magistrate assigns a clerk to copy the necessary sections, pin them to a notice board, and drill assistants on the new format. Errors decline because bad handwriting no longer hides behind uniqueness. The complaint that this standardization stifles creativity is sometimes true, but creativity in this realm has often meant shortcuts. The best officials find room for adaptation within forms. They use the margins for context anticipate questions from above, and write in a tone that persuades without flattery. Failure is not absent, it is managed. A poorly judged case sparks anger that spills into a fight at a wine stall. The magistrate orders a visible rectification, apologizes in a quiet formal way that saves his authority, and revisits the docket procedures that let the error pass. A flood overwhelms a dike despite the schedule. He convenes a hearing on why, listens to the man who warned about a weak spot, and recalibrates the inspection routine so that certain segments receive more attention after unusual rains. The virtue is not avoiding trouble, but absorbing it without drama, and learning without humiliation. Governance reveals itself here as a craft practiced in public, constantly honed with small moves. At dusk, the office closes with a ritual that the runners perform without thought. Inkstones are washed, brushes are stood, bristles up, seals are locked in a small chest, and the day's documents are tied with string according to their destination. Circuit, prefecture, internal. The magistrate walks the yard, feels the evening cool on his face, and thinks not about triumph, but about lists. Tomorrow's docket, 2 water disputes, 3 licenses, a market brawl's echo, sits under a paperweight shaped like a tortoise. He looks beyond the wall where the road sits quiet under a sky that will likely bring a wind from the west. He wonders, as you do with him, whether this discipline, which has saved more lives than valor ever could, will have enough flexibility when the wind carries news not of a local flood, but of a change so large that no docket holds a form for it, and no manual contains a chapter. You hear the word reform not shouted but written. It arrives in packages, scrolls that lay out new programs in measured prose, reforms wrapped in an ethos that treats policy as a lever you can set into the world if you choose your fulcrum carefully. The sponsor is a minister who believes that the state can adjust the economy's incentives not in theory, but in grain and coin, labor and schedule. The proposals are not mystical. They suggest that the state should lend to farmers at modest rates in spring so that men do not fall prey to usury and then cut corners that lead to ruin. That households should be organized into mutual responsibility units for tax compliance and neighborhood security. That the costs of river transport and horse provision should be rationalized to reduce waste and increase speed. That schools should be strengthened so that examinations select men trained for administration rather than merely adept at quotation. Each item speaks the city's language of procedure. Implementation is where ideas become friction. In counties where elders trust officials, spring loans are welcomed as relief. In counties where trust is thin, loans are suspected as traps. Some magistrates use temples as intermediaries, their ledgers and reputations easing fear. Others build new offices and staff them with energetic young men who believe that vigor can substitute for history. Mutual responsibility units work where neighborhoods are real, but bind gracelessly where lines are drawn without regard to paths and kin. A clever magistrate redraws the units along ridges and canals rather than grid squares. A stubborn one insists on the letter and finds that the letter invites avoidance. Reform reveals the variation of local intelligence, like rubbing on a carving reveals lines laid down long ago. The debates at court are as disciplined as they are sharp. Opponents of the programs argue that the state's hand should be light in markets, or else it will crowd out private initiative and breed sloth. That mutual responsibility can curdle into collective punishment that punishes the conscientious, that schools should study broad principles rather than techniques that risk producing narrow minds. Supporters counter that leaving the poor to usury is not freedom, that mutual responsibility replicates old neighborhood compacts with clearer lines. that education can be both principled and practical. The emperor reads, nods, wavers, commands, defers. Within the steady rhythm of audience and memorial, factions settle like silt into patterns that carry names and reputations beyond individual men's temperaments. On the ground, reforms generate new paperwork. Loan registers list names, plots, seed quantities, rates and due dates. Mutual responsibility rosters list households, heads and cross-pledges. Transport reforms lead to tables that match load sizes to boat sizes and river curbs. The economy is not a mere lake into which stones of policy are thrown. It is a canal network that carries flows through familiar channels. A loan in spring turns into a slightly better harvest, which turns into a slightly higher commutation, into coin, which turns into the repair of a bridge. But failures exist. In some counties, loans are captured by the better connected. In others, enforcers overreach and strip dignity. In a few, clerks are tempted by a drift of coin and the tempting phrase, "No one will notice." Here, the censorate matters. Inspectors not blinded by faction record abuses and praise successes, and the record tries to cleave to facts. Over years, reforms are adjusted, postponed, revived, or rolled back. Some elements become permanent by inertia and obviousness. Better school funding leads to fresher brushes and clearer instruction. Rationalized transport timetables reduce spoilage so effectively that no one can argue for returning to the old ways. Other elements become emblems in factional struggle. Loan programs are either proof of benevolence or evidence of overreach depending on who writes, and both have cases to cite. The interesting thing is not who is right, it is how the culture holds the argument inside its own channels. Violent purges are rare, memorials become caustic but stick to forms. Demotions sting but do not destroy. Exiles write poems which, later, generations read and see not only pain but continuity. Effects pass into daily life less dramatically than legends suggest. A farmer who receives a spring loan buys better seed and has an easier season. An artisan training in a better-funded county school learns to write receipts that protect him in disputes and to read notices that keep him compliant. A porter in a neighborhood crime compact knows who to call when a stranger loiters. A woman whose husband works on river transport sees timetables that predict his return with more accuracy. None of these people knows the minister's name who championed the reform. They know that the office in town opens on schedule and that the clerk's handwriting is legible. That is the legacy most reforms actually achieve, a shift in expectation that folds into habit and then into anonymity. Setbacks happen and they teach the limits of policy. A drought lays bare where loans cannot conjure water. A flood breaks a newly repaired dike that engineers assured was sufficient. A war to the north diverts coin and attention south, and local offices must do more with less, while pretending publicly that they are fine. Officials learn to read the difference between circumstances where effort matters and those where endurance is the only honest posture. A wise magistrate communicates failure in the language of process. What was tried, what failed, what could not have succeeded, and what must be done to prepare better for next time. He refuses to frame reality as betrayal or vindication, and in this he practices the culture's central virtue, taking the world as an aggregate of small, honest acts. Later, when the tides of power reverse and some reforms are blamed for faults that were broader than their reach, officials who implemented them with care have careers that survive. Their records show attention to local custom, resistance to excess, honest reporting. Those who pursued zeal at the expense of neighbors become footnotes in cautionary tales recited by students who will sit for exams in halls that have been repaired by budgets partially justified by the success of earlier, now uncontroversial reforms. You feel how The centre's temperament, its preference for procedure over charisma, saves it even from its own enthusiasms. In a system like this, mistakes are embarrassing, but they are less likely to be fatal. You step out of the yamen at dusk and hear the city breathing. Somewhere, a student mutters a passage that will be tested in a week. Somewhere, a boatman reads a posted notice about new patrol routes. Somewhere, a family opens a jar of last autumn's pickles and says a quiet thanks that the year has been ordinary. The reforms you have watched echo here in these small comforts. This is the kind of governance that rarely earns a poem and often earns longevity. You think about the fragility of such a world and its strength, and you ask the question that has shadowed this entire story. When the blade returns to the stage, demanding speed and surprise, will the brush's culture, so proud of its discipline, find a way to write a sentence that moves faster than any it has written before? You stand on a northern wall that looks out over a plain so flat it seems like another kind of sea. The air is dry, the grass short, and horses, not ships, are the vessels that matter here. The arrangement that held for decades was not romance, but arithmetic, a treaty that set a price for peace in silk and silver, a schedule for delivery, and a line not to be crossed. Border markets, guarded by habit as much as by soldiers, turned risk into routine. Patrols counted days and miles rather than glories. Garrisons recorded forage as carefully as they recorded victories. This was how a dynasty that had chosen the brush over the blade survived on an open frontier, by buying time and using it to strengthen what lay behind the line. The logic held until it didn't. A new power rose on the steppe forest frontier, organized with speed the way the dynasty was organized with paper. Diplomatic language that had sufficed in earlier decades now met a neighbor whose confidence ran on different fuel. Early skirmishes felt like statistical noise to men who loved ledgers. Each lost patrol could be explained. Each border town taken could be contextualized in the language of temporary setbacks. The frontier's arithmetic, however, shifted underfoot. Raiders turned into armies, probing became pushing. Letters that asked for reconsideration met answers that were not letters. The old balances strained. Inside the capital, courtiers modeled the problem in familiar terms. How many bolts of silk would forestall a new demand? How many ingots balanced the cost of a campaign whose supplies would have to be carted over distances that used to be bridged by canal? Generals argued for concentration of command. Ministers insisted on checks that history had proved necessary. The emperor listened to advice that was often good within the window of the last century's weather. Some counseled defensive preparations, strengthen the garrisons near the passes, stock forward granaries, and rely on the deterrent of ready walls. Others quietly asked whether the dynasty had, in its success, undervalued the craft of improvisation that war demands. Outside the capital's calculations, border villages experienced the shift as a weight. Farmers who had learned to plan for market days and tax schedules found that the sky might fill with dust that was not weather. Families decamped along roads where post stations suddenly served as refuges rather than relay points. Monasteries opened storehouses according to old rules, but the lines grew and could not be processed by posted hours. The steadiness that had served the state so well, the confidence that routine rescues, faced a tempo that refused to be scheduled. Soldiers drilled in the rhythms of careful, paper-checked logistics found themselves unable to assemble a concentrated punch quickly. Enough. The fall of a capital is loud if you are near and unbearably quiet if you are far. It is made of carts loaded in a crush and doors barred in futility, of officials burning archives not because they hate paper, but because they understand what records mean to men who would wield them in malice, of families clutching seals that are suddenly worthless, and children who do not know why the adults have stopped speaking in the tones they learned from them. It is also made of decisions taken half-knowingly, which road to take when roads clog, which bridge to burn to slow an enemy, even as it strands neighbors, which documents to carry in the hope that somewhere a stamp will still have force. The catastrophe that follows is named in histories that prefer to count emperors, but you experience it in the almanac of displacement, days measured by how far you can walk with a child, nights measured by whether a temple yard will accept one more. Family, meals measured by the number of rice grains sticking to the inside of a pot. Private courage and public failure sit side by side. The state's machinery, so adept at turning grain into cash and cash into roads, struggles to turn shattered roads back into the calendars that made life coherent. You watch officials who still write well try to persuade frightened people that a new center can be built far from the old one, on a river that runs to the sea rather than across a plain that invites cavalry. Their voices are quiet because that is their habit, and because shouting does not rebuild a city. The aftermath is not only loss, it is also reconfiguration. The court finds a harbor and a defensible geography in a southern capital layered in markets and workshops. The agenda is survival through adjustment. The sea, once a supplement to river trade, becomes a highway. The army, once a guarantee of internal order, becomes a shield for a line of water towns whose wealth can feed resistance. The culture that avoided empowering a single general must find a way to promote men who can move quickly without inviting them to think themselves bigger than the state. You feel in this the awkwardness of a system changing its gait under duress. Witnesses, remember individual acts in this transition more than slogans. A general holds a river with a chain-stretched boom and a discipline of crews rowing on drum beats. A minister argues for peace that saves lives and is accused of betrayal by those who cannot imagine laying down a blade without losing a soul. A family from the north opens a noodle shop in a southern alley and survives by selling bowls of broth to men who argue about loyalty and logistics. The enterprise of survival at scale is made of such small continuities: food cooked, boats repaired, accounts kept even when coin has lost its old standards. You walk the new capital's lanes and see faces that carry the same cautious hope you saw earlier, now practiced in another light, with the sea's smell replacing the dry air
of the north.
The question now, heavier and older, seems to fall of its own weight. Can a state that used paper to civilize power use water to hold it off? And if its people must rely on river and sea to outlast a horse's charge, will their habits of schedule, seal, and the slow comfort of posted hours be strong enough to keep them kind to one another when fear teaches other tempos? You step into the southern capital in the morning light and feel a city that has learned to keep its balance while the floor moved. The walls stand over water, the markets face canals, and boat traffic reads like a city's heartbeat. Refugees from the north bring skills, grievances, and the muscle memory of routines that must be rewired. The court settles, not pretending to grandeur, but insisting on order. Audiences are held in halls that are smaller than remembered. Drums mark time, with less pomp and more precision, and offices hum with a practiced urgency. The empire has moved from a land logic to a water logic, and you can sense the relief of officials who find that schedules can still be posted, customs levied, and patrols run on timetables if the battlefield is shifted from open plains to river mouths and bay narrows. War, here, becomes a matter of booms, bridges, and tides. Generals learn to think in currents rather than contours. Chains are stretched across rivers, fire ships are prepared with monotonous care, Patrols are timed to the hour when the tide will carry a boat fastest around a bend. The men who command are selected under the eye of a culture that remains skeptical of martial charisma but now appreciates command that respects procedure. Drills that were once boring become lifelines. Rowers practice starting and stopping on drum beats until muscle remembers faster than fear. Archers repair bowstrings on schedules posted in chalk on a mast. Quartermasters number barrels, check them for leaks with the patience of coopers, and record their weight before and after each embarkation. Courage is measured in consistency. The city conducts commerce and war in the same breath. Warehouses sit next to arsenals. Shipyards build merchant hulls and warboats with the same teams, switching by week and contract. A clerk at a dock may spend mornings collecting duties on pepper and afternoons checking off shipments of arrows. The duality is not hypocritical, it is necessity made ordinary. Merchants continue to trade with distant ports along sea lanes that have swollen with traffic as overland routes have thinned. The sea, which cannot be taxed into peace, offers routes beyond the reach of a horse, and the court encourages these flows, both for revenue and for the morale that familiar goods bring to a people who have lost homes. You drink tea in a quayside pavilion and realize the leaves traveled easier than people, and yet their arrival calms minds and clenches stomachs. Refugee life hardens into new neighborhoods with craft and custom transplanted. Northern bun shops open next to southern noodle stalls. Workshops for porcelain painting reappear in lanes where lacquer had dominated. Printing houses set up forms to meet the demand for news, notices and continuations of histories interrupted by the fall. The press becomes a tool for binding a people into a new narrative, not the boast of invincibility, but the practice of endurance. Broadsides announce patrol timings, price ceilings to curb panic, and temple schedules for aid. The language of governance is as it was, measured, procedural, but the context has changed. Behind each character stands a person who has lost something and is determined not to lose the habit of behaving. The court's diplomacy is conducted with brushes and boats. Messengers go upriver with formal letters seeking terms that spare lives, while preserving a dignity that can be described to grandchildren. War hawks and peace advocates both present their cases in memorials that breathe the same air of duty, and even in disagreement, they share a reverence for the system that allows their arguments to be heard. This is not weakness, it is a muscle memory of a different sort. A polity that can argue with itself without tearing has an advantage over one that speaks only in the register of command. You sit in an antechamber while a memorial is read, and you feel the ancient discipline at work in new stakes. The economy adapts with the quick intelligence of people who remember hunger. Paper instruments proliferate in the southern markets, less as speculation than as glue. Warehouse receipts used to pay carpenters, notes accepted by ferrymen who trust the seals of the offices that issue them, advances against expected tax. Revenues that keep patrols paid and boats repaired. A system that produced prosperity in peace now produces sufficiency in strain. It is not elegant, but it holds. The poor suffer, but the institutions built in earlier, quieter decades reach for them. Charity granaries opened on schedules that have been tested, porridge kitchens run by temples and guilds with posted hours, and lines that move, and magistrates who remand certain debts in flood-stricken wards without denouncing debt itself as evil. In military households, routine has a new tension. Men drill, then go home to rooms rented with borrowed money. Women keep accounts with the same careful hand their mothers used for market purchases. Children play with toy boats carved by fathers who worry whether they will return from a night patrol. Courage is daily. Men show up for rowing practice despite rain. Women hang laundry with their faces turned to the wind where they imagine their husbands are. Officials check lamp oil and rope for abrasion and send back lots that fail. The older pride in reading and writing becomes the pride of counting and checking, because in a river war, a boat that sinks from a bad plug kills more certainly than an arrow. Occasionally, victory arrives not as a banner on a wall, but as a convoy that completes its run. Boats full of grain slip past an enemy block, and the city eats through a winter without famine. A general who understands tides saves a fleet by hugging a shoreline in a fog that would have terrified a less disciplined crew. These successes are logged in reports that understate them, because the habit of understatement protects the city from the intoxication of surprise. Even heroes in this era write as if they were clerks, and their restraint is a kind of self-defense. At night, the southern capital glows with a dimmer, more deliberate light than the old northern city. Lamps are shielded, voices low, patrols strict. People learn to move like a school of fish, with awareness of each other, a willingness to sacrifice a little personal initiative to the group's safety. This is the social side of endurance. The city's boredom is a blessing. Its occasional flares of panic are arrested by procedures that people can follow because they have followed other procedures in other contexts for years. You sit by the water and feel the pull of tide against stone steps, and you wonder whether this careful way of living can hold indefinitely against neighbors who ride faster than boats can row and whose strategies run on different rhythms. You stand at a river city's edge where two worlds meet, the inland river that fed a state of schedules and the vast forces that do not care about schedules at all. A siege tightens, not as a ring of trumpets and banners, but as a constriction of roots. Enemy engineers set up machines that throw stones by the weight of counterbalances, and you feel the shock in your feet as much as your chest. Supply boats attempt night runs, watchtowers whisper signal fires, engineers within the walls adjust angles, ration bolts, and count barrels of oil destined for fires that are as strategic as any council. The city that loves paper now loves rope, chain, and notch-marked beams. You watch carpenters tally what remains and measure not just length, but the morale to use it. The Allied calculations that once seemed clever turn on their makers. Deals struck with distant powers to break a common enemy's back end with the distant power at the gates. The political economy of survival, the bargain that traded pride for time, meets an adversary who measures victory in the silence of other drums. The discipline that kept granaries rotating and patrols punctual now must keep men from breaking in fear, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it cannot. Here, procedure shows its limits. A ledger that cannot be filled because no food remains, a receipt for a shipment that will never arrive, a memorial drafted and never sent because the messenger has nowhere left to run. Amid this, individuals shine with a duty that does not need witnesses. A minister refuses to take the easy road and accepts the fate of a losing cause, writing a final piece in a hand that does not tremble, because to tremble would be to insult the years spent controlling the brush. A general fights to the water's edge and refuses to turn a ship into a refuge when he believes his post is on land. A mother wraps a child in the last good cloth and hands him to a boatman who may make it through a gap in the line. In each case, the action is framed by habit. The minister's writing is careful, the general's order precise, the mother's knot tied well. The culture's virtues hold at the edges even as the center collapses. When surrender comes in one city, it is a formal thing. Seals are handed, heads bow, tears are shed in a discipline that reads as ritual and is actually armor. When last resistance ends in another place, it is on water. A fleet, cornered, chooses to die rather than become tally in someone else's ledger. Boats burn, men drown. A child king passes into story as a symbol that will resist reduction to policy. The accounts of these ends are written by survivors who respect both the craft of memory and the pain of facts. They list names, dates, tides, winds. They avoid metaphors not because they lack poetry, but because the facts are poetry enough. After the fall, the world does not end. It becomes something else. The crafts survive because tools survive. Markets survive because hunger and hope survive. Offices survive in altered form because no civilization can live without lists. People who grew up in the old schedule learn a new one. Seals change shape. Drums beat to adjust times to another court's habits. Memory becomes not a chain that drags, but a rope that helps people cross a gap. In homes where ancestors' tablets line shelves, the young burn incense and learn stories about a time when their people built a city of paper and water and lived well until they didn't, and then they lived differently, still with dignity. History's accounting is stern and also kind. It tallies mistakes and admires endurance. It notes that a state reliant on procedures struggled to improvise under unprecedented pressure. It also notes that the procedures built wealth, literacy, gentleness, and mutual trust that did not vanish. Entirely, when banners changed, the brush did not lose to the blade. It met the blade and yielded, but it wrote down what happened so that later hands could learn. The sea swallowed some of those pages and returned others to shore water, wrinkled and readable. You leave the last scene with a sound in your ears, not the crash of siege engines, but the softer sound of brushes in a school where new rulers, old people, and strange neighbors all need the same thing: clerks to make lists and teachers to train children and markets to price cabbage. You carry with you questions that will not be quiet. When victory depends on both courage and counting, how much courage must accounting culture teach itself? And when the next age remembers this one, will it do so with a smile at the boredom that fed millions, or with a sigh at the speed that surprised it, or with a quiet resolve to practice both patience and agility as if they were not rivals, but hands folded on the same lap?